You should prepare, human. We're having puppies. An alien canine drops the shocking news. Dr. Sarah Chen sat hunched over her microscope in the xenobiology lab of Harmony Point Station, carefully examining a soil sample from the nearby moon of Kepler 442b. The sample contained microorganisms that shouldn't exist according to every known model of extremophile biology, and she was determined to understand how they thrived in such hostile conditions. Her coffee had gone cold an hour ago, but she barely noticed. This was what she loved about working on an interspecies research outpost. Every day brought mysteries that challenged everything humanity thought it knew about life in the universe. The lab door burst open with such force that Sarah nearly dropped her sample slide. Crixus, her research partner for the past 18 months, stood in the doorway with their silvery blue fur standing on end. Bioluminescent patterns rippled across their wolf-like body in waves of purple and gold, something Sarah had only seen twice before during moments of extreme emotion. Crixus's amber eyes were wide and shining, and their tail was wagging so hard it seemed like it might fly off. Sarah, you must prepare immediately." Crixus bounded into the room with the grace of their Canori species, their 4 legs carrying them swiftly to Sarah's workstation. "This is the most wonderful news, the most incredible development. We're having puppies." Her partner was still there, still vibrating with excitement, still staring at her with those enormous eyes full of joy. "I'm sorry, what?" Sarah managed to say. "Puppies, we're having puppies," Crixus repeated, their voice rising in pitch. "The resonance matching completed last night during my meditation cycle. I felt it lock into place. You and I, Sarah, we are pair-bonded. The spark beings will manifest within days." She had learned a great deal about Canori culture during their time working together. The Canori were an ancient species, one of the oldest spacefaring civilizations in the known galaxy. They were brilliant scientists, deeply spiritual, and valued partnership above almost everything else. But reproduction, that had never come up in conversation. "Crixus, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding," Sarah said carefully, setting down her tools and turning to face her partner fully. "I don't know what resonance matching is, and I definitely didn't agree to have puppies with anyone. When 2 beings work in perfect harmony, when their minds synchronize and their spirits align, the bonding happens naturally. It is the greatest gift the universe can bestow. What exactly does having puppies mean in your culture? Because I'm fairly certain our species can't biologically reproduce together." No, the Canori way is far more beautiful. When 2 beings achieve true partnership, their combined essence creates spark beings. They are semi-sentient entities that embody our shared knowledge, our values, our memories, and our potential. They will mature over 6 months, learning from us and the world around them, and then they will choose their own path. What does that mean? The spark beings have free will, Sarah. That is what makes them so precious. We have a situation. Do you realize what an honor this is? Other station personnel stared at her as she passed, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement. By the time she arrived, there were already 5 people waiting outside the commander's door, including Dr. James Morrison, the station's head of xenobiology, and T. Lara, a Canori elder who served as the cultural liaison. Commander Vrel's office was cramped, made worse by their heptoid body that took up considerable space with its 7 segmented sections. "Dr. Chen, please sit. We need to discuss this bonding situation immediately. Crixus has identified you as their pair bond. This has never occurred between a Canori and an alien species, never in our 15,000 years of recorded history. Sarah, this could revolutionize our understanding of interspecies compatibility. If humans can bond with the Canori, what does that say about our neurological frameworks, our consciousness patterns? This could prove that humans have a deeper capacity for connection than we ever imagined. What if these spark beings are incompatible with human essence? What if they suffer? What if this creates a diplomatic incident? Can I just say something?" She waited until the room fell silent. "I care about Crixus. They're my friend and my research partner, and we work incredibly well together, but I never signed up to be a parent to semi-sentient spark beings. I don't know the first thing about Canori reproduction or child-rearing, or whatever this is. Spark beings are born with much of our knowledge already integrated. They are autonomous from the moment of manifestation. We simply guide them toward their choice. She dove into every database she could access, reading everything available about Canine biology, spark being development, and the bonding process. She learned that the bonding was triggered by prolonged proximity, deep trust, and compatible neural patterns. She and Crixus had spent 18 months working closely together, often for 12 or 14 hours a day, their minds synchronizing as they solved complex problems together. They had developed a shorthand way of communicating, anticipating each other's thoughts and needs. Apparently, that was enough. She also learned something that Crixus hadn't mentioned. In approximately 3% of bonding cases, when the partners were not truly compatible, the spark beings manifested unstable or in distress. Most didn't survive the 6-month maturation period. The Canine considered this shameful and rarely spoke of it publicly. When Sarah confronted Crixus about this in the lab, her partner's luminescent patterns dimmed to almost nothing. "I am terrified," Crixus admitted quietly. "I have never bonded before. What if I am the one who is incompatible? What if my joy has condemned innocent spark beings to suffering? We'll figure this out together. That's what partners do, right?" It pulsed gently, almost like a heartbeat. As she watched, it grew brighter and began to take shape. Within minutes, a small creature materialized, no larger than a house cat. It had Crixus's wolf-like features, but with oddly human eyes and a translucent, shimmering quality to its form. The spark being looked at Sarah, then looked at itself, then looked back at Sarah. When it spoke, its voice was small and uncertain, carrying both human and Canine tonal qualities. "Am I supposed to exist?" This was a consciousness, confused and new, asking the most fundamental question any being could ask. She thought about all the human children throughout history who had been born into uncertain circumstances, who had wondered if they were wanted, if they belonged. She climbed out of bed and knelt down to be at eye level with the spark being. "Yes," she said firmly, "you are absolutely supposed to exist, and we're going to make sure you have the best possible chance at whatever life you choose. I promise you that." Whatever happened next, they would face it together. The spark being that manifested in Sarah's quarters that first night chose the name Flicker, which seemed perfectly appropriate given how their luminescent form pulsed and wavered like a candle flame in the wind. Within 48 hours, 3 more spark beings appeared. Nova emerged during a staff meeting with a burst of bright white light that startled everyone in the room. Ember materialized in the station's garden dome, drawn to the warmth of the thermal vents. Gleam appeared last, quietly forming in the corner of the lab while Sarah and Crixus were working, as if they had been patiently waiting for the right moment. Sarah immediately cleared out an entire wing of the research lab and began converting it into what she could only think of as a nursery, though that word didn't quite capture what was needed. The spark beings were conscious from the moment they appeared, but they were also confused and uncertain about their own nature. They could communicate, but they didn't always understand what they were saying. They had access to fragments of Sarah's memories and Crixus's knowledge, but those pieces didn't always fit together coherently. The other Canine on the station were fascinated but puzzled by Sarah's approach. Tilara visited frequently, watching as Sarah set up different areas for the spark beings to explore. "This is unnecessary," the elder said one afternoon. "Spark beings find their own way. You cannot force their development. They need to explore, but they also need safety. I don't see why spark beings would be different." Flicker asked me yesterday what happiness feels like. They have Crixus's memory of happiness, but they've never experienced it themselves. That's not knowledge, that's just data. I never thought of it that way. We Canine simply accept that spark beings will integrate their inherited knowledge naturally. But perhaps they need help making sense of it. Another contained human art, literature, and games. A third was left completely empty except for raw materials, allowing the spark beings to create whatever they wished. She also instituted daily family meetings where everyone, including the 4 spark beings, could discuss their feelings and experiences. The approach seemed strange to everyone except the spark beings themselves, who thrived under Sarah's guidance. They began developing distinct personalities. Nova was bold and curious, constantly asking questions about everything. Ember was quieter, more contemplative, spending hours in the garden dome observing the plants and small creatures there. Gleam was playful and mischievous, hiding objects and leaving puzzles for Sarah and Crixus to solve. And Flicker, the firstborn, seemed to carry the weight of being the eldest, always watching over the others with protective concern. Word of Sarah's methods spread throughout the station and beyond. Representatives from the Galactic Council arrived to observe. Other species who had attempted cross-species bonding in the past began requesting copies of Sarah's protocols. Dr. Morrison started documenting everything, convinced they were witnessing a breakthrough in understanding consciousness development across species. But then, 3 months into the maturation period, Flicker began to destabilize. Their form, which had been growing steadier and more defined, started to flicker erratically again. Sometimes they would lose cohesion entirely for a few seconds, becoming nothing but scattered points of light before pulling themselves back together. They stopped participating in activities and spent most of their time alone in the empty choice chamber. Sarah found them there one evening, their form barely holding together, pulsing irregularly like a dying star. "Flicker, what's wrong? Are you in pain?" "I'm broken. There has to be another way." She read human studies about children of mixed heritage struggling to find their place in the world. She studied cases of adopted children reconciling multiple cultural identities. She even dove into old Earth philosophy about the nature of self. Crixus found her in the lab at 3 in the morning, surrounded by holographic displays showing dozens of research papers. "Sarah, you need to rest. You're exhausting yourself." "There's an answer here, I know there is. Humans have dealt with identity struggles for thousands of years. We've helped people integrate different parts of themselves. This is the same thing, just with a different type of consciousness. What if some spark beings are simply not meant to exist as permanent individuals? Then that should be Flicker's choice, not something that just happens by default because we didn't try hard enough to help." She just sat there, cross-legged on the floor, and started talking. "When I was a kid, my family moved from China to America," she began. "I was 7 years old. Suddenly I had to learn a new language, new customs, new ways of being. At home, my parents expected me to be Chinese, to honor our traditions. At school, everyone expected me to be American, to fit in with them. I felt like I was being torn in half, like I couldn't be both things at once. But then my grandmother told me something that changed everything. She said I didn't have to choose. I could be something new. I could take the best parts of both worlds and create my own identity. I could be Chinese American, which isn't just Chinese plus American, it's its own thing entirely. You're not half of anything, you're completely yourself. You don't have to reconcile the human parts and the Canori parts because you're neither of those things. You're Flicker. You're the first of something entirely new." They moved differently, spoke differently, even thought differently than either of their parent species. They were unique, and they were finally comfortable with that uniqueness. The remaining 3 months of the maturation period passed quickly. The spark beings continued to develop and grow, each finding their own path with Sarah and Crixus's guidance. The family meetings became celebrations of their individuality rather than attempts to shape them into predetermined forms. Finally, decision day arrived. The 4 spark beings gathered in the main chamber with Sarah, Crixus, T-Lara, Commander Vrel, and several other witnesses. Each spark being would now choose their permanent form and purpose. Flicker stepped forward first. "I choose to become an individual," they announced. "I will remain here on Harmony Point and help other families like ours. I will be a bridge between species, teaching others that being different is not being broken. We choose to merge into one being," they said in unison. "We will travel to the Canori homeworld and serve as an ambassador, carrying human understanding to our people. I choose to remain as I am for now. I want to explore the galaxy to learn more before I decide what I will become. I choose delay and I choose freedom." This human approach to nurturing has created something remarkable. Sarah's insistence on their autonomy, her structured yet flexible approach to their development, had fundamentally changed how multiple species viewed consciousness and family. That evening, Sarah and Crixus stood in the now-quiet nursery wing, looking at the spaces where their children had grown and learned. "I was terrified," Crixus admitted. "Every single day I was afraid we would fail them. We gave them what every child deserves, regardless of species. We gave them love, guidance, and the freedom to choose who they want to be." The Galactic Council has offered us positions creating the first interspecies family development program. They want us to help other bonded pairs. It's about showing up every day and doing the work, even when you're scared and don't know what you're doing. Other bonded pairs arrived seeking guidance, and Sarah's protocols were adapted for dozens of different species combinations. The station that had once been a simple research outpost became a symbol of something greater, a place where different beings could come together and create new forms of family, new types of consciousness, new possibilities for connection across the stars. And through it all, Sarah kept a photograph on her desk, a holographic image of that first night when Flicker had asked if they were supposed to exist. She kept it as a reminder that the most important question any being can ask deserves the most honest answer, and that every consciousness, no matter how unexpected or unprecedented, deserves the chance to find its own way in the universe. 6 months after the Spark beings had made their choices, Harmony Point Station had transformed into something nobody had anticipated. The quiet research outpost now bustled with activity as representatives from 17 different species arrived to learn about interspecies bonding and family development. Sarah found herself spending less time in the xenobiology lab and more time in what had become known as the Family Integration Center, a name that made her smile every time she heard it, because it sounded so formal for what was essentially organized chaos. The first major challenge came when a Threlic engineer named Zos and their human partner Marcus arrived at the station in distress. The Threlic were an insectoid species with compound eyes and crystalline exoskeletons that refracted light in beautiful patterns. Zos and Marcus had bonded 3 weeks earlier, and their first spark being had manifested 2 days ago. But unlike the semi-solid forms that Canori spark beings took, this creature was entirely gaseous, a swirling cloud of colored vapor that seemed to be in constant pain. "It screams," Marcus said, his face haggard from lack of sleep. "Not with sound, but we can feel it in our minds. We don't know what to do. The Threlic have never bonded with humans before. We don't have any protocols for this. How do they normally develop? The human elements prevent crystallization, and the Threlic elements prevent it from existing comfortably as vapor." Sarah thought about Flicker's struggle with identity, how they had been trying to be both human and Canori simultaneously instead of accepting that they were something entirely new. What if crystallization isn't the answer? What if this spark being needs to find a completely different state of matter? It can't exist as plasma, that would destroy it. What if this spark being needs to exist in a state that we haven't discovered yet, something between gas and liquid, or something entirely different? We keep trying to force new forms of consciousness into old categories. The spark being is suffering because we are limiting it with our expectations. They built chambers with varying temperatures, pressures, and energy levels. They introduced elements and compounds that might allow for new types of molecular bonding. And most importantly, they talked to the spark being, explaining what they were trying to do, asking it what felt right and what felt wrong. The breakthrough came when the spark being entered a chamber filled with a supercooled magnetic fluid. Its gaseous form suddenly began to interact with the fluid in unexpected ways, creating something that wasn't quite solid, liquid, or gas. It was a gel-like substance that could change its density and viscosity at will, flowing like water one moment and becoming firm like rubber the next. The chaotic colors settled into smooth, pulsing patterns. The mental screaming stopped. Marcus broke down in tears of relief. "It's not in pain anymore. I can feel it. It's curious now, exploring what it can do." More bonded pairs began arriving at Harmony Point, each presenting unique challenges. Sarah found herself drawing on every aspect of human-child development knowledge, adapting theories about attachment, learning, and identity formation to consciousnesses that were utterly alien. A Quilnari merchant and their human partner arrived with twin spark beings that existed in a quantum superposition, simultaneously occupying multiple locations until observed. Sarah helped them understand that these spark beings weren't broken or strange. They were simply experiencing reality in a way that neither parent species did naturally. She introduced the concept of Schrödinger's cat, explaining how uncertainty could be a feature rather than a flaw, and helped the parents create an environment where the spark beings could learn to control their quantum states rather than being controlled by them. A Vexorian diplomat and their human partner struggled with a spark being that seemed to exist partially in a different dimension, visible only as shadows and reflections. Sarah worked with xenophysicists to map the dimensional overlap and create spaces where the spark being could interact with three-dimensional reality more easily. She also spent hours with the spark being, teaching it Earth games like shadow puppets and mirror exercises, helping it understand that being different from others didn't mean being less than others. Through all of this, Sarah's own family continued to grow and evolve. Flicker had become an invaluable member of the Family Integration Center, their unique perspective helping new spark beings understand their own struggles. They had developed a counseling approach that combined Kanori meditation techniques with human talk therapy, creating something that worked across species boundaries. Nova Ember, as the merged being now called themselves, sent regular communications from the Kanori homeworld. They were teaching traditional Kanori about human concepts of family and nurturing, slowly changing millennia of cultural assumptions. Some elder Kanori resisted, insisting that the old ways were sufficient, but younger generations were fascinated. Nova Ember reported that several young Kanori had begun incorporating human-style family structures into their own bonding practices. Gleam had indeed traveled extensively, visiting dozens of worlds and studying various forms of consciousness. They sent messages filled with wonder and discovery, describing species and phenomena that Sarah had never imagined. But they also sent something else, a steady stream of insights about consciousness development that came from their unique position as an observer without permanent form. These insights became foundational to Sarah's expanding understanding of interspecies family dynamics. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day helping a Horgath warrior and their human partner understand why their spark being kept splitting into multiple smaller entities, Sarah collapsed into a chair in her quarters. Crixus found her there an hour later, staring at nothing in particular. "You are depleted," Crixus observed, their patterns showing concern. "You give too much of yourself to these families. These spark beings deserve every chance to find their way, just like Flicker and the others did. This is the natural way of things. Human history is full of conditions that were natural and deadly until we learned how to treat them. High infant mortality was natural until we developed better medicine and nutrition. Lots of things are natural until someone figures out how to make them better. This refusal to accept that some suffering is inevitable. Other species have learned to accept the natural order. But humans always insist that the order can be improved, that suffering can be reduced, that better outcomes are possible through effort and innovation. It is why our spark beings thrived. It is why families across the galaxy are finding hope where they previously found only acceptance of loss. Your human stubbornness to make things better is a gift, even when it exhausts you. They wanted Sarah to train others in her methods, to codify her approaches into teachable protocols. They were offering her a position as the director of interspecies family development for the entire galactic community. Sarah sat with the offer for a long time, thinking about what it meant. She thought about Flicker's first question, whether they were supposed to exist. She thought about all the spark beings she had helped since then, each one unique and precious. She thought about how many more were out there, struggling without support, or worse, never getting the chance to exist at all because potential parents were too afraid of the unknown. She accepted the position. Over the next year, Sarah traveled to different worlds, training counselors, scientists, and support workers in the principles she had developed. She taught them that every consciousness deserved respect and support regardless of its form. She showed them how to adapt human nurturing techniques to wildly different biological and energetic beings. She emphasized that the goal was never to force spark beings into predetermined categories, but to help them discover and become their truest selves. Crixus traveled with her, providing the Kanori perspective and helping others understand that traditional methods, while valuable, were not the only way. Together, they became a symbol of what interspecies partnership could achieve, not through dominance or assimilation, but through genuine collaboration and mutual respect. The program wasn't without critics. Some species viewed it as human cultural imperialism, an attempt to impose human values on alien consciousnesses. Others worried that too much structure would stifle the natural development of spark beings. Sarah listened to these concerns carefully and adjusted her approaches accordingly. She learned to recognize when human methods were helpful and when they needed to step back and let alien perspectives lead. But the results spoke for themselves. The survival rate of spark beings in families that used the new protocols increased dramatically. More importantly, the spark beings that emerged from these supported families showed greater confidence, clearer sense of self, and stronger connections to both parent cultures. They became bridges between species in ways that had never been possible before. One day, nearly 2 years after Flicker's first manifestation, Sarah received a message that made her stop everything she was doing. It was from a remote research station near the galactic core. A human scientist and their partner from a species called the Luminari, beings of pure energy that humanity had only recently made contact with, had bonded. Everyone thought it was impossible. The Luminari had no history of bonding with corporeal species. But it had happened, and now they had a spark being that existed partially as matter and partially as energy, flickering between states so rapidly that it was barely visible. The message was simple: please help. We don't know what to do, but we heard you believe all consciousness deserves a chance. Can you help ours? We can try, Sarah said, responding to the message. We'll be there as soon as possible, and remember, your spark being is supposed to exist. We'll help them figure out how. The journey to the research station near the galactic core took 8 days, even with the fastest available transport. Sarah spent most of that time reviewing what little information existed about the Luminari, a species that existed as coherent patterns of electromagnetic energy. They had no physical form in the traditional sense, yet they possessed intelligence, culture, and, according to recent discoveries, emotions that manifested as fluctuations in their energy signatures. Dr. Elena Rodriguez met them at the docking bay, her face showing the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. She was a quantum physicist who had been studying energy-based life forms when she met her Luminari partner, Radiance Apondon. What started as scientific collaboration had somehow transformed into a bond that neither species fully understood. "Thank you for coming," Elena said, her voice cracking slightly. "I didn't know who else to call." The spark being appeared 5 days ago, and it's been deteriorating ever since. Radiance is terrified that we've created something that can only suffer. When they communicated, it came through a translation device that converted their energy patterns into sound. "We have made a terrible mistake. Our spark being exists in constant instability, unable to hold either physical form or pure energy state. It flickers between existence and non-existence. This is agony for any consciousness. Let me understand what's happening before we decide anything is a mistake." The consciousness flickered rapidly between a barely visible physical form and bursts of light, never settling into either state for more than a fraction of a second. The pattern was chaotic, almost violent in its intensity. But Sarah noticed something that the parents, in their distress, had missed. The flickering wasn't random. There was a rhythm to it, a pattern that repeated every few seconds. The spark being wasn't failing to choose between matter and energy. It was trying to be both simultaneously, and the rapid switching was its attempt to achieve that impossible state. "Crixus, do you see the pattern?" Sarah asked. Her partner studied the spark being carefully, their luminescent patterns pulsing in time with the flickering. "Yes. It is like a heartbeat. The spark being is not unstable, it is oscillating. This might be its natural state. It doesn't understand what it is. Imagine being born and finding that your entire existence is something that nobody has ever experienced before, something that seems wrong to everyone around you. The suffering isn't from the flickering itself. It's from thinking the flickering is a problem that needs to be fixed. What if it's not matter or energy, but both, cycling between states so fast that it's essentially a new form of being altogether? It violates the principle of coherent identity. A being must be one thing or another. Why can't consciousness oscillate too? Nothing as complex as consciousness could maintain that kind of state. Perhaps it has found a way to exist that our science has not yet described. Instead of creating different environments for the spark being to explore, she worked on helping it understand its own nature. She brought in quantum physicists to explain superposition and wave-particle duality. She showed it videos of oscillating systems in nature, from heartbeats to planetary orbits. She even played music, demonstrating how sound itself was a wave oscillating through space. But the real breakthrough came when Flickr arrived. Sarah had sent for them, knowing that their experience with identity integration might be valuable. Flickr had continued to grow and develop since making their choice to become an individual, and they had helped dozens of other Spark beings find their paths. Flickr approached the chamber where the oscillating Spark being existed and simply observed for a long time. Then they spoke, their voice carrying the unique harmonic quality that blended human and Canori elements. "You're like me, but different. I was trying to be two things and failing. You're actually succeeding at being two things, but you think you're failing. It's not a flaw, it's your identity. You're not a being that should be matter or energy. You're a being that is the transition between them. You are the bridge itself." As the Spark being began to accept its oscillating nature as fundamental rather than problematic, the patterns became more controlled. It learned to vary the speed of its flickering, sometimes cycling so fast it appeared as a stable blur, sometimes slowing down enough to experience extended moments in either state. The confusion and pain faded, replaced by what could only be described as curiosity and joy. Alina wept the first time the Spark being successfully communicated, choosing to speak in a way that matched its nature. It would form physical vocal cords for a fraction of a second to produce a sound, then exist as energy to modulate that sound, then return to matter for the next phoneme. The result was a voice unlike anything anyone had heard before, simultaneously solid and ethereal. "I am Pulse," the Spark being announced. "I am the heartbeat between states. I am what happens in the space between being and becoming." Theoretical physicists scrambled to revise their models of what was possible for sentient beings, but Sarah was more interested in the practical implications. If consciousness could exist as an oscillation between different states, what did that mean for other forms of hybrid existence? She began working with a team of researchers to identify other Spark beings that might be struggling not because they were incompatible with themselves, but because they were trying to exist in ways that current scientific understanding didn't recognize as possible. They found several cases where Spark beings had been declared failures or returned to the source, when in reality, they might have simply needed someone to recognize their unusual nature as valid rather than broken. This realization led to what Sarah called the diversity of existence protocol, a framework for approaching Spark beings with the assumption that their form, whatever it might be, could be valid and sustainable if properly understood and supported. Instead of comparing new Spark beings to existing templates, the protocol encouraged researchers to observe patterns, identify what the Spark being was trying to do, and then help it succeed at being itself rather than forcing it into predetermined categories. The protocol revolutionized how the galactic community approached not just Spark beings, but consciousness itself. Species that had previously been considered non-sentient because they didn't exhibit consciousness in recognizable ways were reevaluated. New forms of intelligence were discovered that had been present all along but overlooked because they didn't match expected patterns. 6 months after Pulse achieved stability, Sarah received an invitation to address the full Galactic Council, something rarely offered to individuals from recently spacefaring species like humans. She stood in the Great Chamber, surrounded by representatives from hundreds of worlds, and felt the weight of what she needed to say. "When I first learned I was going to have Spark being children, I was terrified," she began. "I didn't understand what was happening, and I didn't think I was prepared. But I realized something important. No parent is ever truly prepared. Every child, regardless of species or form, is unique. What makes a good parent isn't having all the answers. It's being willing to learn, to adapt, and to see your child as they truly are rather than as you expected them to be. Humanity brings something valuable to the galactic community, not because we're special or superior, but because we've spent thousands of years learning how to raise helpless, dependent young into independent adults. We've made countless mistakes, but we've also developed deep understanding of how to nurture consciousness through its most vulnerable stages. We've learned that every individual deserves the chance to discover who they are, and that our job as guides isn't to shape them into what we want, but to help them become what they're meant to be." A Horgath representative stood, their massive form intimidating even in the peaceful setting. Some say your methods are too interventionist, that you impose human values on alien consciousnesses. The core principles, respect for individual consciousness, structured support combined with freedom to explore, the belief that every being deserves the chance to find their own path, these aren't uniquely human values. They're universal principles that every sentient species can understand, even if they express them differently. The specifics change, but the underlying philosophy remains. Every consciousness matters. Every form of existence can be valid. And with the right support, spark beings can thrive in ways we never imagined possible. Flicker was there too, along with several other spark beings who had gone through the family integration program, each one unique, each one thriving. The Galactic Council voted to expand the family integration program across all member worlds and to establish it as a fundamental right for all bonded pairs and their spark beings. They created a new position, Ambassador of Consciousness Development, and offered it to Sarah. But Sarah surprised everyone by declining. I appreciate the honor, but I'm not an ambassador or an administrator. I'm a mother and a scientist. What I do best is sit with confused spark beings and help them figure out who they are. That's what I want to keep doing. They were spark beings themselves. They understood the struggles from personal experience, and they had both proven themselves capable of bridging different species' perspectives. The Council agreed, and for the first time in galactic history, positions of significant authority were given to beings who had been born from interspecies bonds. That night back on Harmony Point, Sarah sat in the garden dome with Crixus, watching the stars through the transparent ceiling. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "That day you burst into my lab and announced we were having puppies. And you showed the entire galaxy that consciousness is far more diverse and beautiful than anyone imagined. That is what you humans understand so well that you can teach it to the stars." And in every chamber, in every counseling session, in every moment of discovery, the lesson remained the same. Existence takes infinite forms, and every single one of them deserves the chance to flourish. Claude is AI and can make mistakes. Please double-check responses.